Senator Lindsey Graham will now have to testify in a Georgia probe investigating efforts to overturn the 2020 election. The Supreme Court declined Graham's request to block the subpoena. He argued the Constitution's speech or debate clause shielded him from testifying. 2 years ago, the Georgia Secretary of State told the Washington Post that Graham appeared to suggest he tossed legally cast ballots in counties with high rates of non-matching ballot signatures. Quote, "It sure looked like he was wanting to go down that road," Brad Raffensperger said. Graham called that ridiculous. Joining me is CNN contributor John Dean, former White House counsel to President Nixon, and CNN senior legal analyst Ellie Honig. Ellie, so Senator Graham's office is calling this a win for him, saying the court affirmed the Constitution's speech or debate clause could apply in certain circumstances. What do you make of this ruling?
It's not a win for Lindsey Graham, Anderson. It is a loss on balance for Lindsey Graham. He had argued that he was exempt from testifying, that he didn't have to testify at all under the speech and debate clause, which is part of the Constitution that says a sitting member of Congress, like Lindsey Graham, can't be forced to answer questions outside of Congress. But the problem for Lindsey Graham is the federal courts, up to and including the Supreme Court, said yes. However, that only applies to your legitimate legislative activities, and anything you were doing with the Trump campaign, any efforts to interfere with the election, to pressure state officials, that's all fair game. So now, bottom line, Lindsey Graham has to go in front of the grand jury, take an oath, and answer questions from a prosecutor.
And John, if Senator Graham invokes the speech and debate clause in an effort to avoid answering certain questions about his post-2020 election activities, would it meet the bar? I mean, many people may not know what that clause was intended to be used for.
Well, it's a new clause to most of the courts down there because they don't address it very often. So, yes, he can raise it. Yes, he can hide behind it for a while. But the high court, as well as the lower courts, have gotten themselves familiar with this clause, and it's pretty limited. It's limited to his legislative activities, as Ellie said. So he's not going to get very far with this.
Well, I mean, Ellie, if the senator objects to a question during testimony, how does that get decided?
So this is the problem. The Supreme Court said if there's a dispute about a question, you can go back to the district court, which is the federal trial level court. I guarantee you Lindsey Graham is looking at the calendar here thinking there will be a new Congress early January of 2023. And if he can throw enough issues up in dispute, the strategy may be to try to stretch this out until the new Congress takes over. I'm sure prosecutors are aware of that and are going to try to dispose of these questions as quickly as possible.
John, Senator Graham's attorneys have said the Fulton County District Attorney has informed them that Graham's neither a subject nor a target in the investigation. He's simply a witness. Does that preclude him from invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination?
Well, it doesn't preclude him if they get into areas that he thinks he might be in trouble. And I think there might be some areas where he could have some trouble. As the court noted, he had cajoled and exhorted officials down there, and that may be misconduct. So he'll be kind of trying to step around those areas and stay out of them. And if it gets a direct question, he'd have to take the Fifth. But Anderson, that's a disaster for the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which he hopes to be soon.
Ellie, when it comes to, the possible substance of Graham's testimony, what's the most important information that Fulton County, the district attorney, would like to elicit from him?
Well, let's remember, Lindsey Graham is not a senator from Georgia. He's a senator from another state, from South Carolina. He was in coordination with Trump in the Trump campaign. I think they're going to look there. And I think they're going to look at Lindsey Graham's efforts to pressure local and state officials in the state of Georgia. I think that's exactly where prosecutors are going to focus.
Ellie Honig, John Dean, appreciate it. Thanks. Good evening. We begin tonight with breaking news. According to authorities, the man charged with trying to kill Paul Pelosi and separately accused of plotting to hold House Speaker Nancy Pelosi captive and break her kneecaps told officers on the scene, quote, "This was a suicide mission." David DePape was in court today in San Francisco. Those words are from the state's motion to detain him. CNN has obtained a copy, and that's not all, he reportedly said. And we'll have more of the details on that in a moment. Just in tonight, Hillary Clinton is speaking out for the first time about the attack. Here's what she just said on MSNBC. To that point, there were more reasons to believe the threats facing lawmakers, including Speaker Pelosi, has not gone away. Some of it is fueled by conspiracy theories like the ones the defendant apparently bought into. The former president amplified one as well today. Also, as if to underscore that threat picture, there was this from the trial of 5 alleged leaders of the so-called Oath Keepers. Jurors were shown a series of text messages from January 6 referring to Speaker Pelosi. One of them reads, quote, "Was hoping to see Nancy's head rolling down the front steps." We begin in San Francisco, where Paul Pelosi remains in the hospital facing what Speaker Pelosi says will be a long recovery from a skull fracture and where his alleged assailant was in court. cameras were barred, but CNN's Veronica Miracle was there. She joins us now with the breaking news. So what did we learn today?
Well, Anderson, we just obtained that motion to detain. It was filed by the district attorney, and it argues why David DePape should not be released from custody. It describes him as on a suicide mission and that he had plans to target other politicians. It quotes him as saying to Paul Pelosi about Speaker Pelosi that she's number 2 in line for the presidency, right? And when Mr. Pelosi agreed, DePape responded that they are all corrupt and said, we've got to take them all out. The motion also says the attack on Paul Pelosi with that hammer was caught on body camera video. And it also says that DePape told officers that he didn't have plans to intentionally harm Mr. Pelosi, but that if he escalated the situation, he would go through him if he had to. Now, we saw him in court today. He was arraigned on multiple felony charges, including attempted homicide, burglary, elder abuse, among others. He entered not guilty pleas for all of those. The Pelosi family was not in court, but the prosecutor told the judge that they are asking for privacy during this very traumatic time. The judge also signed a protective order which says that Mr. DePape cannot contact Paul or Nancy Pelosi and that he can be nowhere near their residence. Anderson?
What was this alleged attacker's demeanor like during his court appearance?
Well, the first thing that I noticed about him when he came in is that his shirt was half off because his right arm was in a sling, and I later learned from the public defender that he actually dislocated his shoulder during his arrest. When he came into court, he was able to walk on his own. He had a very tall and large stature, but a very solemn demeanor, and just sat down and went through the proceeding. And when I asked the public defender about his mental status, his mental condition, the public defender said he could not speak to it, only that he met with DePape very briefly yesterday. Anderson?
Veronica Miracle, appreciate it. Now, and first on CNN, what the Pelosi family are about to face. CNN special correspondent Jamie Gangel joins us with that. Jamie, what have you learned?
Anderson, we've been told members of the Pelosi family, as soon as tomorrow, are expected to be able to hear the audio from that 911 call that Paul Pelosi placed to police, and also to see the body cam footage of the San Francisco police officers who responded to their house the night he was attacked. Anderson, just as a reminder, we know Paul Pelosi placed that 911 call at the beginning of the attack after convincing the assailant to let him go to the bathroom where his phone was charging, and that he spoke cryptically to police. The body cam footage is expected to show what the police saw when Paul Pelosi opened the door and his assailant attacked him with a hammer, fracturing his skull. Just a little while ago, Anderson, the DA just told CNN that the phone call was actually very brief. That recording will be brief, but she confirmed the body cam footage does show the horrific attack with the hammer, Anderson.
And do you know if this 911 audio and the body camera footage, you said is it going to be made public soon?
We don't know yet, Anderson, but look, as we've seen with cases, 911 calls, body cam footage, they are released in many cases. And I think what's important is this audio and video could provide critical evidence, whether it's hearing what the assailant said, if anything, on that phone call. But certainly that attack, it may very well provide firsthand critical evidence of what the assailant did. And that striking video is important because it not only documents what happened, that the assailant was looking for Nancy Pelosi, who, let's just remember, was the target of this attack, but perhaps it will help combat these crazy lies, conspiracy theories that have been spread on social media, Anderson.
Jamie Gangel, appreciate it. Despite all we've learned about what happened over the last several days from reporting like that and the federal criminal complaint filed yesterday, the conspiracy theories continue to spread. Today, as we mentioned, the former president offered one of his own. Of course he did. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the details, except to say that it's one more thing for law enforcement to debunk. Joining us now, San Francisco Police Chief Bill Scott. Chief Scott, appreciate you joining us. Just heard from Jamie Gangel reporting the Pelosi family will be able to hear the 911 call, see the body cam footage of the video. Earlier tonight on CNN, the district attorney said that you see the attack on the body camera footage. Is it clear to you why the attacker hit Mr. Pelosi with a hammer as the police were approaching? Was there some trigger to that?
Well, first of all, Anderson, thank you for having me on. What is crystal clear to me is he tried to kill Mr. Pelosi. Now, what was going on in his mind as to why he did that, I can't speak to that. But what is very clear to me from viewing that body-worn camera is he tried to kill Mr. Pelosi.
Can you confirm how many times Mr. Pelosi was struck?
Well, we know it's at least one, and we're trying to figure that out through the evidence and the injuries. But we know it's at least one is what can be seen on the body-worn camera footage. It was an immediate tackling of this Mr. DePape by the officers, and we're talking about a matter of from the time that door opened until the hammer was swung at Mr. Pelosi. We're talking about no more than about 3 seconds. So this was a very rapidly unfolding series of events, and we know it happened at least once, but the officers responded immediately to tackle him and disarm him and try to save Mr. Pelosi's life. So things happened very, very quickly.
In the 911 call, was Mr. Pelosi able to identify himself as Speaker Pelosi's husband? Was the dispatcher aware of who he was, or did she become aware of who he was during that conversation?
Well, he did identify himself, and officers knew that they were responding to the residence of Speaker Pelosi and her husband. I just want to clarify one thing. The call was approximately 3 minutes. And as I said, and I'll say again, there was the dispatcher trying to really figure out and decode what was being said on that call. And so she attempted to keep him on the phone in order to do that. But at the end of the day, she did figure it out and raise the priority of the call, thinking that it wasn't like what was reported by Mr. Pelosi. There was something more there. And I say again, I think her being able to figure that out, along with Mr. Pelosi's keeping his wits about him, he was heroic, and the dispatcher figuring out that there was something more was also heroic. And I think that that action saved his life.
So it was a 3-minute call, a 3-minute 911 call. It is remarkable, and we're starting to see more details of what was said on that call, but that the dispatcher was able to figure out through sort of the cryptic words that Mr. Pelosi was using. Is that something that dispatchers are trained on?
Yeah, they are trained to try to figure things out, and it comes with experience, but also it's intuitive. I mean, you have to have a sense for things, and Heather Grimes had the intuition to just say something is not right here. It's not really making sense, and your training, experience, and just plain old intuition were the three ingredients, I think, that made her do what she did in terms of upping the priority of that call and making sure that officers got there quickly.
As you may know, the former president has called into question the circumstances of the attack. You've said previously this was a break-in. That is still accurate, yes?
Yes, that is absolutely accurate. This was a break-in. There is no doubt in anybody's mind that has anything to do with this investigation of whether or not this was a break-in. This was a break-in, plain and simple. Evidence is overwhelmingly clear. And I don't know why anybody would say otherwise, but I'm here to tell you that it was a break-in.
Well, Chief Scott, I appreciate your time tonight. I appreciate all what your officers have done. Thank you. I want to get some perspective now from CNN senior law enforcement analyst and former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, also CNN Chief Law Enforcement and Intelligence Analyst John Miller. Andrew, what stands out to you about this case, given what we have learned today?
Well, obviously, Anderson, the feds and the state are going after this attacker with everything they've got in two simultaneous prosecutions that will likely land this guy in jail for the majority of the rest of his life, which is great. And both cases appear to stand on pretty solid ground. I mean, just the information we learned from the federal affidavit that was filed yesterday is remarkable in its detail, and the statements made by the defendant himself really put him in a very bad position for these prosecutions going forward. So That all seems to be lining up well. On the back of this misinformation and layer upon layer of additional lies and conspiracy theories that just breathe additional oxygen into this insanity. It's very frustrating.
Yeah. John, I know you've been poring over the details of actually the interaction between them.
I mean, it's chilling. It's something out of a Stephen King novel. He's asleep in bed, and a voice wakes him up and says, "Are you Paul Pelosi?" It's 2 o'clock in the morning. He says, "Yeah." He says, "Where is Nancy?" He said, "She's not here. She's in Washington." The voice says, "When is she going to be back?" Now, Anderson, stop tape here for a minute. In context, that sounds crazy to us when we are talking to somebody while we're sleeping. But remember, this is a family that's lived around security details in their house, in their kitchen, outside.
They have a tremendous, I mean, I've seen her security detail. It's quite large.
People coming and going. He's groggy out of a dead sleep. And when he says, "Well, I'm going to tie you up and we're going to wait for her," it is clear to him something is very wrong. He gets out of bed and he heads for the elevator. He knows he can get in the elevator. There's a phone in there. He can stop the elevator. And Mr. DePape blocks his path. He's talking to him. "Can I call someone for you? What do you need her for? Is there something I can help you with? She's second in line for the president. We have to take them all out."
That's what he says to
Yeah.
Mr. Pelosi.
And then he says, "Well, is there someone I can call for you?" He says, "No, this is the end of the line for you." At this point, he diverts to the bathroom. He knows his cell phone's on charge there. He turns it on, puts it on speaker, calls 911, and then engages in a conversation where he's trying to get the message across to the operator, but not trying to get...
Because the guy can hear him on
right,
the 911
The guy's on the other side of the door. He's got a handful of zip ties and a hammer. And he says, "There's a man here, and he's asking for my wife, Nancy Pelosi, and I don't know him," he says when she asks. And she says, "Do you need police, fire, or ambulance?" And the suspect is glaring at him. He said, "No. How about, is the Capitol Police here?" And she said, "You know you're calling the San Francisco police." He says, "Yeah." She said, "Do you know this man?" He said, "No, I don't." And then the suspect responds, "No, I'm a friend of theirs." So she's gleaning something's definitely not right here and makes that priority A call when the police are coming. Now, remember, the suspect's thinking here is, "I know I went by a million cameras to break in here. I know Paul Pelosi has seen me. I now think that the police are on the way, and he's heading downstairs. I know I'm going to get caught. I know this is the end of the line for me now." When the police get there and Paul Pelosi opens the door and heads back to the suspect, trying to keep things calm, the police put their flashlight through the door and they see the two men standing there with the hammer. And the officer says, "What's going on here?" And Paul Pelosi lets go of the hammer, and then he's struck. If you look at the suspect's later statements to police, what he allegedly said is, "I knew this was a suicide mission at that point, and that I wasn't going to get away. And if I had to go through him, I was going to go through him. He had escalated this by calling the police and putting his hands on the hammer, and I had to hit him."
John Miller, Andrew McCabe, appreciate it. Thank you. Next, how... With just a week to go into midterm elections, some of the biggest names in national politics are campaigning for House and Senate candidates in key states. President Biden, former President Obama, former Vice President Pence operating along traditional party lines. Outgoing Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney crossing them, campaigning for Democrats. And take a look here at what the final days look like with former President Trump joining the fray in Iowa, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida. CNN Jeff Zeleny joins us now in East Lansing, Michigan, where Liz Cheney campaigned today for Democratic Congresswoman Elisa Slotnick. So, Jeff, Congresswoman Cheney says she doesn't know if she's ever voted for a Democrat in the last 40 years. What did she say at the campaign event tonight?
Anderson, she did say, and this ended just a few minutes ago, she said this is the first time she's campaigned for a Democrat, but made clear the reason that she is doing so is because she believes this is a critical moment for the country. She said it's a time of testing where every American cannot be a bystander in the fight for democracy. Of course, this comes 3 months after Liz Cheney was defeated in her own primary, and just a couple months before she leaves Congress on her own. But she made clear she still wants to try and influence the shape of the next session of Congress. If Republicans happen to win the majority, she clearly wants to limit that and try and avoid any election deniers being sent to Washington. But she framed the stakes of the race like this. And these two members of Congress have some history. They sit on the House Armed Services Committee. They both have served this country at the State Department and the Pentagon as well. But Anderson, she was very blunt tonight, saying the chips are down. This is a time of our testing.
Do we know what, if any effect it might have with just a week to go?
Well, look, I mean, this is a very close race, one of the most competitive races in the country. And it's clear that to win, she needs to win Republicans and independents. That's a Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin. This is a very competitive district. It's always been won by President Trump. It's been redrawn a little bit, so it's now a +1 Biden district, if you will. But she has to win independents and Republicans. So that's what they hope the effect of this is tonight, kind of getting a message to some of those Republican or moderate voters who may be swayed by Liz Cheney.
And Congresswoman Cheney also said earlier today that she would back another Democratic candidate in a race. Do we know who?
We do. She actually made a stop in Ohio before coming here to Michigan, and she was asked about the J.D. Vance-Tim Ryan Senate race. And she said, look, just given all the questions that J.D. Vance, the Republican Senate candidate, has raised about the 2020 election, obviously he was backed by the former president, she said she simply could not vote for J.D. Vance. So she said if she was an Ohio voter, she would vote for Tim Ryan, the Democratic candidate there. Unclear how much any of this will impact the races. But here in Michigan, in this district in particular, Anderson, it is clear that there are many independents and Republicans who are questioning the outcome of this. So this could help, at least on the margins, in a tight race.
Definitely appreciate it, because this is, in the end, a numbers story. We're joined here by CNN's one and only senior data reporter, the one and only Harry Enten. So which 4 Senate races have you been analyzing and have changed over the last month?
Yeah, so let's talk about those 4. Let's start in Arizona, which I think is the easiest story to tell because Mark Kelly has held a consistent lead, but that lead has shrunk. It's now down to 3 points over Blake Masters, the Republican. You go to Georgia, that race, oh my God, so tight, so tight. And what's key about Georgia is neither Herschel Walker nor Raphael Warnock are above 50%. And what does that mean if this forecast is in fact correct, exactly on the button? That would mean a potential runoff in December to potentially decide the United States Senate, because Georgia, you have to win to get a majority vote to win. Go to Nevada. How tight is the race there? Another race in which the candidates are even. And then, of course, you might end up in the state of Pennsylvania where, here's a surprise given all the previous graphics, the candidates are again even. They're even again.
And that's, I mean, Oz has come up a little bit. He was further back.
Yeah, that's correct. So if you essentially took a look at the race, all these races about 2 months ago, let's say the beginning of September, can't believe that was 2 months ago, how fast the summer has gone. If you were to look at the race 2 months ago in all these races, the Democratic candidates were leading in all of them. So it's very clear looking at the math right now that it's Republicans that have momentum.
And why is that?
Why is that? Here's the reason why. Take a look right now at what I would call the fundamentals. Take a look at satisfaction with the direction of the country that people have right now. Below 20%. Look at congressional approval rating, just above 20%. Look at presidential approval rating at about 40%. And if you look at each of those different factors on satisfaction, that's the worst in the midterm since 1982. You look at congressional approval rating, that's the second worst since 1982. You look at presidential approval, that's again the second worst since 1982. So I don't think it's so much of a surprise. The fundamentals are kind of bringing the Democrats back to the pack.
Given if you look at that, the worst, second worst, isn't it surprising that GOP candidates aren't farther ahead?
Yeah, I think it would perhaps be surprising, but here's the thing. Candidates matter. I know this is perhaps a surprise in our polarized era, but if you look at the net favorability, that is the favorable minus unfavorable of the Republican candidates in Arizona, in Georgia, in Nevada, in Pennsylvania, they're all underwater. So you sort of have Biden going in one direction, sort of pulling the Democrats down, but the Republican candidates are themselves pulling themselves down. But I do have one question for you, Anderson, and that is, who do you favor in the World Series?
Well, yeah. Do you know who's playing? I do not know who's playing.
We do have
the Cardinals.
Oh, that is a baseball team. It's
No, I
also
know
a
it
football
is.
team.
Yeah.
It's also a football team.
Oh, the Phillies and the Houston Astros.
There you go.
The Astros were in a series a while ago, weren't they?
They have played in multiple World Series over the last decade.
I vaguely recall that.
They won a World Series.
Last decade.
They
is it already the World Series?
Has
that happened? Hasn't baseball been going on for like all year?
No, it has not been going on. It just started. Do you know what city the Phillies are from?
Philadelphia.
Very good.
Yeah, well, the Phillies.
Well, sometimes, I don't know. You didn't know what the mascot was for the Buffalo Bills.
The giant dollar bill. Yeah, of course I do.
Yeah, of course.
Don't be silly.
It's a
All right,
bison.
Anson, thank you. Coming up, we'll be right back.